Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mr. Graham's Too Long Didn't Watch, a series where I, Mr. Graham, explain the plot and historical significance of different movies throughout time. This episode, we're going to be talking about a defining film in the period of German Expressionism, and that is called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. But to truly tell the story of this film, we have to wind back a little bit further in time, to the end of the war, in fact. What war, do you ask? With the Great War, of course, the aftermath of which turned out to be not so great after all. You see, today we know it as World War I, Europe's largest superpowers squaring off to consolidate their power not just at home, but in their imperial assets across the globe. You know, America was also in there at some point too. But the outcome of the war was devastating for almost everybody who took part. Devastation which for Germany would only be a single step in a series of crazy transformations for decades to come. The period that came directly after the war was known as the Weimar period, named for Germany's new democratic government which took power in 1918. This period was one of extreme social and political upheaval, even crisis. Germany was left with the tab for almost all the damage caused by the war in the Treaty of Versailles. This caused severe hyperinflation. Couple that with Germany's weak appetite for their new democratic government and the fragmenting political landscape which toppled between extremist parties, including the Nazis, and you have a recipe for another world war. But that wouldn't be for another couple of decades. In the meantime, Germany's artists were blossoming in fascinating ways. The psychological impact of World War I was traumatizing, to say the least. Citizens who were once bursting with optimism and nationalistic fervor now distanced themselves from reality. With a newly found distrust for authority, and still scarred and humiliated from violence and defeat, they turned their back on classical standards of things like beauty and morality, instead opting for experimentation and subjectivity. This time spawned artistic movements like Dadaism, New Objectivity, and of course Expressionism. Each blended social and political critiques with radically modern styles that defied the art that came before them. And so now, finally, with all of this in mind, we can begin our work unpacking one of the most formative films in all of history. Our story begins with a young man named Francis. As Francis is sitting in the park one day, he encounters another man who sits beside him, and the two decide to swap stories, Forrest Gump style. Francis begins recounting an ordeal which he and his fiancée Jane had recently experienced. A flashback takes us to a small village in Germany, where a fair has just popped up. Fun, right? Wrong. It's only a matter of time till Francis and his friend Alan make their way to the deeply unsettling Dr. Caligari in his mysterious sideshow attraction. During the show, the doctor presents his sleepwalking, fortune-telling wonder boy, Cesare the Somnambulist. Dr. Caligari awakens Cesare from his hypnotic slumber to answer questions from the audience. Not exactly my idea of a fun night out, but to each their own. Against Francis's warnings, Alan decides to ask Cesare how long he has left to live, to which Cesare responds, till the dawn. Later that night, a shadowy figure appears in Alan's home and stabs him to death in his bed. Francis is all broken up about his buddy's untimely death, and the obvious place to point the finger is at the creepy weirdo and his sleepy sidekick. But wait, the next night another man is caught attempting to murder an elderly woman. Surely it must be him, right? Francis is unconvinced, and instead he chooses to focus his investigative efforts on the doctor and Cesare. One night, while spying on the two, he observes what seems to be Cesare sleeping contentedly in his box, but in reality, Cesare is making his way into Jane's house. That's right, Jane, Francis's fiancée. Moments before he plunges his knife into Jane, he's stunned and overcome with her beauty. He can't possibly kill something so beautiful. I mean, he's a mindless murderer, but come on, standards, people. Instead, Caesar tries to abduct Jane, dragging her across the crooked streets and rooftops of the town before eventually giving up and fleeing from an angry mob. Catching up to the situation, Francis is so confused. He could have sworn he had just seen Cesare sleeping in his box just moments before. The police investigate, only to find that it was a dummy inside of the box all along. Dr. Caligari is somehow able to escape in all of the confusion, but he's followed by Francis until both arrive at an insane asylum. After they enter the asylum, a disoriented Francis is shocked to learn that Dr. Caligari is actually the director of the asylum, and all along he's been enacting sick experiments on his patients, using them as tools of murder. The police are called, and Dr. Caligari is subdued and put into a straitjacket. Cesare's body is discovered as he has died of exhaustion. And somehow, the story is not over yet. We return to present day, where Francis is finishing up his story. But in a twist ending, it's revealed that Francis himself is an inmate in the same asylum. As he returns, we see that Cesare and Jane are both inmates as well. Caligari appears to be the director of the asylum once more, but when Francis accuses him, this time, Francis is pounced upon and put into a straitjacket. It turns out that Francis was insane all along. So what do we take from all of this besides the fact that we should never greet strangers at a fair? This film is a complex metaphorical masterpiece. Given the context we established at the beginning of our lesson, it's easy to see the subjective nature of reality in this film. For one, once we enter Francis's story, the mise en scene, or the French word for stuff in a scene, i.e. the sets, props, costumes, makeup, it's all heavily distorted. This shows us that we are not in the objective reality that we all experience, but rather we are entering the twisted mind of a deeply troubled man who is recounting an imaginary story to cope with his own madness. The fair, the fiancé, the frenzied, murdering madman, it's all a product of Francis's condition, and we are seeing it through his unique and subjective lens. But what is that condition exactly? Perhaps it's symbolic of the madness and confusion felt by many citizens in Germany at the time. People who stumbled mindlessly, like Cesare, into the violence commanded of them by their sinister overseers. In this case, Dr. Caligari plotting sneakily in the shadows is akin to the militaristic German government marching their soldiers into certain death. And what about Jane? Perhaps she represents the innocence and optimism that was stripped from both Francis and the German people. The twist ending is the cherry on top. Just as Germany was unable to process their loss and devastation before being walloped with even more crisis, so too is Francis locked in a perpetual state of doubt, trying to process what exactly brought him to this point. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you've learned something valuable. In the words of Woody from Toy Story, so long, partner.